Before we get into today's episode, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone listening around the world. It still amazes me how far this show has travelled, so a few quick shout outs this week. Emily, listening in Melbourne, Australia, Jason in Toronto, Mark from Manchester in the UK, Sarah in Chicago, Liam tuning in from Dublin, and Tandy in Cape Town. I also saw messages this week from Lucas in Berlin, Hannah in Auckland, and Raphael listening in Sao Paulo, which is incredible. It means a lot. Thank you so much. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, let me know where you're tuning in from. I genuinely love seeing how global this community has become. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a quick review or sharing the episode really helps more people discover what they hide, hidden crimes in plain sight. As usual, you can find What They Hide on all social platforms, and our email address is in the show notes. Alright, let's crack on with the show. This episode contains discussion of serial murder, violence, and disturbing crimes against young travellers. Some details may be upsetting for some listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Welcome back to What They Hide. This week's episode is the beginning of a two-part story, and for the first time on this podcast, we're heading down under to a stretch of forest just outside Sydney. A place that looks peaceful during the day, tall eucalyptus trees, red dirt tracks, winding deep into the bush, and long quiet roads where travellers once stopped to hitchhike between cities. But in the early 90s, police in New South Wales began making discoveries in that forest. Human remains, then more remains, and then more again. Backpackers from across the world had come to Australia looking for adventure. What they found instead was something far darker, hidden in the dense bushland of Belanglo State Forest. At first, the cases seemed unrelated. Different victims, different countries, different timelines. As investigators began piecing the evidence together, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Young travellers were disappearing along the same highways, last seen hitchhiking, last seen accepting rides from strangers, and somewhere along those long rural roads, someone had been hunting them. His name was Milat, and the crimes he committed in the Australian bush would become one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in the country's history. Over the next two episodes, we'll examine the backpackers who vanished while travelling through Australia, horrifying discoveries inside Belanglo State Forest, the investigation that slowly began closing in on a suspect, and the man whose family connections, lifestyle, and behaviour would eventually lead detectives straight to his door. Because what happened in Belanglo wasn't just a series of murders. It was a story of travellers searching for freedom and a predator waiting along the roadside. This is Milat and the killings in Belanglo State Forest. Belanglo State Forest sits about 90 minutes south of Sydney. At first glance, it looks like the kind of place people come to escape the city. Tall eucalyptus trees stretch high into the sky. Red dirt roads wind through dense bushland. The air carries the smell of dry leaves and dust, and when the wind moves through the forest, it creates a sound that seems almost endless. A quiet, rustling whisper, moving through thousands of trees. For most people, driving past the forest in the early 90s, it was simply another stretch of Australian wilderness. A place hikers explored, a place locals used for trail riding, a place travellers might pull over to rest during long drives between Sydney and Melbourne. But in September of 1992, something inside Belanglo State Forest changed forever. A group of runners had entered the forest for a normal afternoon jog. The dirt track wound through the trees like dozens of others, scattered across the landscape. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The quiet hum of insects, the wind brushing through the canopy above. But as they moved deeper along the trail, something caught their attention, something partially hidden beneath the leaves. At first, they weren't sure what they were looking at. The shape seemed wrong, out of place, and as they stepped closer, the realization came slowly. What they had found wasn't an animal, it was human remains. Police were called to the forest. Officers arrived expecting to deal with a single discovery, perhaps an isolated crime. As investigators began searching the surrounding area, they uncovered something far more disturbing. Because this wasn't the only body in Belanglo. Within hours, detectives began locating more remains scattered across the forest floor. Different locations, different burial sites, but unmistakably connected. Young travellers, backpackers, people who had arrived in Australia from across the world, drawn by the promise of adventure. And now they had been found here, hidden beneath the trees. As detectives mapped the locations of the discoveries, the scale of what they were looking at began to sink in. This was not a single murder. This was something far larger. Multiple victims, all discovered in the same forest, all buried or concealed in similar ways. And the victims had something else in common. They had all been travelling, hitchhiking along the highways that cut through New South Wales. The realisation sent shockwaves through investigators, because if these victims had been taken while hitchhiking, that meant the person responsible had been moving along the same roads thousands of travellers used every day, watching, waiting, looking for opportunity. Belanglo State Forest covers thousands of hectares, dense bushland, stretching far beyond the reach of main roads. It is the kind of place where someone could dive deep into the forest without being seen, the kind of place where a secret could remain hidden for years. And as police expanded their search through the trees, they began uncovering more evidence that the forest had been used repeatedly. This was not a single crime scene, it was a dumping ground. By the time the search teams finished their work, investigators knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. A series of murders, victims from multiple countries, a killer who had used Australia's long rural highways as hunting grounds. And somewhere out there, the person responsible was still free. But the investigation was about to reveal something else. Because the victims discovered in Belanglo were not strangers to one another. Their stories were connected by a common journey. Young travellers moving through Australia with backpacks, maps, and plans for adventure. People who had trusted the kindness of strangers along the road. And somewhere along those roads, one stranger had been waiting. His name was Ivan Milat. And the crimes hidden inside Belanglo State Forest would soon become one of the most infamous serial murder cases in Australian history. This is part 1 of the Belanglo murders, and it begins with the travellers who vanished along the highway. To understand how the murders in Belanglo happened, you have to understand the culture of travel in Australia during the 80s and 90s. For young travellers arriving from Europe, North America and New Zealand, Australia had a reputation. It was a place of distance, open roads, endless coastlines, a country where adventure seemed to wait just beyond the next town. And thousands of young backpackers came every year to experience it. They arrived in Sydney with backpacks, guidebooks, and the same plan many travellers had followed before them. Work a little, travel a lot, move between cities, meet people along the way, and see as much of the country as possible before the money ran out. For many of those travellers, hitchhiking was simply part of the experience. Australia's distances are enormous. A journey between Sydney and Melbourne can take hours. Public transport between small towns was limited, and so hitchhiking became a normal part of backpacker travel. Standing along highways with a sign, a thumb out, waiting for the next car to stop. For decades it had been common. Drivers often picked up travellers along the road. Conversations would begin with the same questions. Where are you headed? How long have you been travelling? Where did you come from? Sometimes it led to nothing more than a short ride. Sometimes it led to friendships that lasted for years. For the most part, it was seen as safe, normal, even expected. But hitchhiking has always depended on one thing: trust. Trust that the person stopping their vehicle means no harm. Trust that the stranger offering a ride is simply another traveller moving along the same road. For most people, that trust is well placed, but occasionally, it isn't. The highways south of Sydney were particularly popular with backpackers. The road between Sydney and Melbourne was one of the most travelled routes in the country. Tourists moved along it constantly, stopping in small towns, exploring national parks, looking for the next place to stay. And scattered along that highway were countless quiet roadside pull-offs, places where travellers waited for rides, places where strangers met, places where someone could disappear without drawing immediate attention. Because when someone is travelling from one country to another, their movements often go unnoticed for a while. Friends and family may expect days or even weeks between phone calls. Travel plans change, routes shift, and if someone disappears along the road, it can take time before anyone realises something has gone wrong. That reality created the perfect environment for someone who wanted to hunt unnoticed. A person who understood the rhythm of the highways, the routes the backpackers use, the places where someone might be alone beside the road. And somewhere along those highways in the late 80s, someone had already begun watching. In December 1989, two young travellers set out on a journey along the same highway. They were James Gibson, a 20-year-old Australian man from Victoria, and Deborah Everest, a 19-year-old from Melbourne. The pair had met while travelling. Like many young backpackers, they were making their way north, through New South Wales. Their journey should have been simple, just another stretch of road between cities. But somewhere along that route, something went wrong. Because after leaving the highway, James Gibson and Deborah Everest were never seen alive again. At the time, their disappearance raised concern among friends and family, but the connection to Belanglo State Forest had not yet been discovered. That truth would remain hidden for years, buried beneath the trees, waiting to be found. And as investigators would eventually discover, James and Deborah were not the only travellers who had vanished along those roads. Next, we tell the story of the first victims and the journey that led them into Belanglo State Forest. In the summer of 1989, the highways running between Melbourne and Sydney were busy with travellers. Holidaymakers, truck drivers, backpackers moving between Australia's major cities. Among those travellers were two young people whose paths had crossed during their journey: Deborah Everest and James Gibson. Deborah was 19 years old, from Melbourne. Friends described her as adventurous and independent, the kind of person drawn toward new experiences, someone who wanted to explore the world beyond her hometown. James Gibson was 20, also from Victoria. He had been travelling through Australia, moving between cities and meeting people along the way. Like many young travellers at the time, he relied on hitchhiking to move between destinations. It was common, normal, and for most people along those highways it worked without incident. At some point during their travels, James and Deborah met, they decided to continue part of the journey together. Two young travellers sharing the same road, the same plan, the same excitement of seeing what lay ahead. In December 1989, they were travelling north along the Hume Highway, the major road connecting Melbourne to Sydney. For hitchhikers, this route was one of the easiest ways to move between the two cities. Cars passed frequently, drivers were often willing to stop, and the journey could be completed in stages with multiple rides. But somewhere along the highway, Deborah and James accepted a ride that would become their last. The exact moment remains uncertain, the location unknown. What investigators would later piece together suggested the two travellers had been picked up by someone who appeared helpful, friendly, just another driver moving along the road. Instead, they had encountered a man who had been watching those highways for opportunity, a man who understood exactly how vulnerable hitchhikers could be. At some point during the journey, Deborah Everest and James Gibson were taken into Belanglo State Forest, a vast area of bushland stretching far from the main roads. Once inside the forest, the isolation is immediate. The sounds of traffic disappear, the trees grow dense, and the red dirt tracks twist deeper into the bush. It is the kind of place where someone could vanish without anyone nearby noticing. What happened next would remain hidden for years, because after entering Belanglo State Forest, Deborah Everest and James Gibson disappeared. For their families, the disappearance was confusing and frightening. At first, it was possible to believe there had been misunderstanding. Travellers sometimes changed plans, routes shifted, phone calls home were delayed. But as time passed, the silence became impossible to ignore. Something had gone wrong. Police were notified, investigations began, but with hitchhikers, the trail often disappears quickly. There are no tickets, no passenger lists, no confirmed final location, just a stretch of highway where someone accepted a ride from a stranger. For several years, the fate of Deborah Everest and James Gibson remained unknown. Their names became part of a growing list of missing travellers. Unanswered questions scattered across thousands of kilometres of Australian highway. Then, in 1992, the search inside Belanglo State Forest changed everything. When police began uncovering human remains in the forest, investigators realised they might finally have answers for several long, unsolved disappearances. Among the victims discovered were Deborah Everest and James Gibson. Their bodies had been concealed in separate locations within the forest. The discovery confirmed what their families had feared for years. They had been murdered. For detectives, the significance of that discovery was enormous, because Deborah and James had vanished in 1989, but the other victims found in the forest had disappeared years later, which meant something deeply disturbing. The killer responsible for the Belanglo murders had been operating for years, using the same forest, the same methods, the same highways where backpackers waited for rides. The deaths of Deborah Everest and James Gibson would eventually become recognised as the earliest known murders connected to Belanglo State Forest, but they would not be the last, because in the years that followed, more backpackers vanished along the same highways, and their stories would lead investigators back to the same place, the same forest, and eventually, the same man. Next, two young travellers from Britain, and another journey that ended in Belanglo. Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. By the early 1990s, Australia had become one of the most popular destinations for young travellers from Europe. For many backpackers, it represented freedom, a place where the journey itself mattered as much as the destination. People travelled light, moved between cities, met strangers who quickly became friends, and followed the long highways that connected Australia's vast distances. Among those travellers were two young women from Britain, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, both in their early 20s, both exploring Australia together. Caroline had grown up in England with a curiosity about the world beyond home. Friends later described her as warm and outgoing, someone who embraced the adventure of travelling. Joanne was quieter, but just as excited about the journey ahead. The two had become close friends during their time in Australia, and like thousands of other backpackers, they were making their way along the roads between cities, moving gradually through the country, stopping wherever the road led them next. In April of 1992, Caroline and Joanne were travelling through New South Wales. They were hitchhiking south along the Hume Highway, the same major route connecting Sydney and Melbourne. It was a familiar route for backpackers. Cars passed constantly. Drivers often stopped to offer lifts. Most rides lasted an hour or two before travellers were dropped off and continued the journey with someone else. At some point during the journey, Caroline and Joanne accepted a ride from a driver who appeared willing to help them continue south. Someone who looked like just another motorist travelling the same road. Someone they believed they could trust. But somewhere along that route, the journey changed. The car left the highway, and the road led into the bushland of Belanglo State Forest. Belanglo was remote, dense forest stretching far beyond the roadside, tracks winding deep into the trees. Once a vehicle left the main roads and entered the forest, it quickly became isolated from the outside world. It was the kind of place where someone could drive for kilometres without seeing another person, and once inside, the silence of the bush replaced the sounds of the highway. That silence would hide what happened next, because after that moment, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters were never seen alive again. Back in Britain, families waited for the next phone call, the next letter, the next update from Australia. Travellers often stayed in touch sporadically. Weeks sometimes passed between calls, so at first the silence did not seem unusual, but eventually the worry began to grow. Friends and relatives contacted authorities, missing persons reported were filed, and slowly the realisation began to take hold. Something had gone terribly wrong. At that time, police didn't know yet the connection between the missing travellers. Each disappearance was investigated separately, each family hoping for answers. But the truth remained hidden inside the forest. When investigators began searching Belanglo State Forest in 92 and 93, they started uncovering the remains of multiple victims. Among those discovered were Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. Their bodies had been concealed within the bushland. Like the earlier victims, they had been taken into the forest and murdered. For detectives, the pattern was now undeniable. Young travellers hitchhiking along the same highway, picked up by someone offering a ride, then driven into Belanglo. The discovery of Caroline and Joanne confirmed something investigators had begun to fear. The murders were not isolated incidents. They were connected, part of a series of crimes carried out by someone who understood the highways, someone who knew exactly how backpackers travelled, and someone who had used Belanglo State Forest again and again. By this stage of the investigation, police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but they still did not know who he was. Somewhere out there, the man responsible was still living his life, driving the same roads, moving through the same communities, and watching the same highways where travellers waited for rides. Once the first bodies were discovered in Belanglo State Forest, the atmosphere changed immediately. At first, detectives had approached the scene expecting a single crime, a body in the bush, An isolated murder. Terrible, yes, but limited. Something they could contain, something they could map, something they could solve. Belanglo did not give them one crime scene. It gave them a landscape. And landscapes are harder to understand than rooms. Belanglo State Forest covers thousands of hectares of bushland southwest of Sydney. Long stretches of eucalyptus forest, dense scrub, fire trails cutting through the red dirt and loose stone. At ground level, visibility can be poor. Trees crowd the tracks. The bush swallows sound. And once you move away from the main road, the sense of isolation is immediate. A person could stand only a short distance away and remain unseen. A car could disappear down a trail within seconds. A body could remain hidden for years. When police began their first systemic searches, they did what investigators always do. They secured the immediate area, marked the first discovery point, began establishing a perimeter. Photographs were taken, notes made, distances measured. Officers moved carefully, scanning the undergrowth, looking for anything disturbed, anything buried, anything that didn't belong. At first the search was narrow, a few officers, a defined space. Then another set of remains was found, and the scale of the operation changed. What had looked like one hidden body now appeared to be part of something larger, something repeated, something deliberate. And the question that follows a second body is always darker than the question that follows the first. Now, what happened here? But how many times has this happened before? Officers began moving deeper into the forest. Not quickly, not dramatically. This kind of search is slow, methodical, exhausting. The earth in Belanglo is layered with leaf litter, scrub, roots, and deep soil. The terrain shifts underfoot. Searchers use metal probes to test the ground, pressing them carefully into areas where the surface seemed disturbed. Sometimes the probe would slide easily through the soft earth. Sometimes it would stop against roots or buried debris. And sometimes it would tell them something else was there. Every unusual resistance meant stopping, marking the location, clearing the brush, digging slowly by hand. Because if there was another body beneath the soil, the ground itself had become evidence. And evidence must be approached carefully, even reverently. As the search widened, the discoveries continued. Different sites, different victims, not clustered together, not thrown in one place, but spread across the forest in ways that suggested familiarity. The killer knew Belanglo, knew where to turn off the main track, knew where the bush thickened, knew where someone could dig without being seen, knew where the forest would hold silence. That detail was important to investigators because it suggested not just violence, but comfort. Someone had moved through Belanglo with confidence, the way a local moves through known ground, the way a hunter moves through a place he has already chosen. By now, this was no longer a local search. This was becoming one of the most significant murder investigations in New South Wales. The search operation expanded. More officers, more forensic staff, more mapping, more coordination. A dedicated task force was formed to handle the growing complexity of the case. Because the dead in Belanglo were not all from one town, or one country, or one moment in time. The victims were young travellers, backpackers, people whose movements had crossed state lines, national borders and hostile routes. And now, police had to work backward through all of it. Who were they? When had they vanished? Where had they last been seen? How had they ended up here? Investigators spread maps across tables, highways, hostels, train stations, bus routes. They began cross-referencing missing persons reports. Australia, Britain, Germany, travellers who had disappeared while moving through New South Wales, travellers whose journeys had simply ended, and as names began aligning with the bodies found in the forest, the horror sharpened. These were not local disappearances. This was an international case. A killer in the Australian bush had preyed on people who had come from across the world, young travellers following one of the most familiar backpacker routes in the country. And the search in Belanglo was only the beginning. There's something uniquely haunting about the discovery phase of a serial murder investigation, because this is the point where missing persons become confirmed dead, where hope, however faint, collapses. For families, uncertainty is unbearable. The certainty could be devastating in a different way. Now, there is no possibility of mistaken plans, no fantasy of a delayed postcard, no imagined explanation waiting at the end of the phone line. Now, there is only the truth, and the truth is buried. Every time police uncover remains in Belanglo, another family somewhere in the world moved from uncertainty into grief. A son, a daughter, a friend who should have kept travelling, a backpacker whose route should have continued south or north or inland, anywhere but here. And for the detectives work in the forest, that emotional weight grew heavier with each discovery, because the dead were accumulating, and so was the implication. As the remains were identified, a clearer pattern began to form. Young travellers, mostly backpackers, travelling through New South Wales, often hitchhiking between Sydney and Melbourne, vanishing along the highway, then later discovered in Belanglo State Forest. That pattern told investigators something critical. The killer was not hurting randomly in the forest. The killer was using the roads. Belanglo was the dumping ground. The highway was the hunting ground, which meant the murders had likely begun much earlier than discovery of the bodies. And that meant something worse. For years, the person responsible had moved undetected along one of the busiest backpacker routes in Australia, stopping, offering lifts, driving away, and returning to ordinary life, again and again. Police now had to do something incredibly difficult: reconstruct movements that had happened months, and even in some cases years earlier. That meant speaking to hostel workers, other travellers, petrol station attendants, drivers who had once picked up hitchhikers and dropped them off again. Tiny details suddenly became crucial. A memory of 2 women by the roadside, a man in a 4-wheel drive, a traveller mentioning they were heading south, a last confirmed sighting near a motorway exit. Each fragment mattered, and each fragment revealed how vulnerable backpacker travel could be. Because on the road, identity becomes fluid. You're often known only by first name. You move hostels quickly. You depend on informal rides. And if you disappear, it may take time before anyone knows exactly where to start looking. For a killer, that delay is useful. For investigators, it's a nightmare. As more details emerged, the media began reporting what police were becoming increasingly convinced of. This was not one murder. This was a series. The discovery of multiple backpackers in Belanglo ignited fear across Australia and beyond. Parents in Britain and Germany watched the news. Young travellers in hostels rethought their routes. People who had once accepted rides casually now began looking at highways differently. The trust that hitchhiking depended on had been shaken. Not everywhere, not permanently, but deeply. Because if a serial killer had been operating along the backpacker trail, then every roadside encounter now held a new shadow. Belanglo itself began to change in the public imagination. Before the discoveries, it had simply been forest, a patch of bushland along a road most people drove past without naming. Now it was something else, a place associated with violence, with concealment, With years of hidden death, the search turned the forest into more than a location. It became a witness, a silent landscape that had held the truth for far too long. And investigators understood something important. If the forest had held these bodies for years, then the killer had likely visited it more than once, which meant he was probably familiar with it, comfortable there, maybe local, maybe someone whose work or habits brought him through those roads regularly, someone for whom Belanglo was not strange ground, but chosen ground. At this stage, detectives still did not have a suspect they could name publicly, but their thinking had changed. They were no longer looking for a random predator passing briefly through New South Wales. They were looking for someone who knew the highways, knew the bush, knew the habits of backpackers. Likely a man, likely local or semi-local, likely mobile, and very likely someone who had done this more than once without drawing serious attention. That last detail was the most unsettling. Serial killers are often imagined as people living outside society, drifters, loners, strangers. But the developing profile in Belanglo suggested something else. Someone who could move between ordinary life and the murder without visible disruption. Someone who might work a normal job, live in a normal house, talk casually to neighbours, and drive into the bush and kill. There are cases that alter the people working them. Belanglo was one of them. Forensic officers, search coordinators, detectives, they were no longer dealing only with evidence. They were dealing with a repeated act of predation. The remains of young travellers found far from home, and the growing sense that the killer had treated the forest as a private graveyard. That knowledge changes the emotional climate of an investigation. The work becomes colder, more urgent, and more personal. Because once you know there are multiple dead, every unresolved missing backpacker report starts to feel dangerous. Every old statement must be revisited. Every roadside encounter might mean more than it once seemed to. By the time the police had finished searching Belanglo State Forest, the scale of the investigation had changed completely. This was no longer a case about a missing backpacker, or even two. It was now clear that multiple travellers had entered the forest over several years and never left. For detectives, one fact quickly became impossible to ignore. The killer had not chosen Belanglo by accident. The forest was remote, difficult to navigate, a maze of dirt tracks and fire trails that twisted deep into the bush. Someone unfamiliar with the area could easily become lost, but the person responsible had moved through it confidently, returning again and again and again. That detail mattered, because it meant the killer likely knew Belanglo very well. Perhaps someone who had grown up nearby, someone who had worked along the roads south of Sydney, someone who spent time driving through the region regularly. Investigators began examining maps again. Highways, forests, small towns scattered along the road between Sydney and Canberra. They started asking new questions. Who lived nearby? Who worked nearby? Who spent long hours driving through the region? The more detectives looked at the case, the more one possibility began to take shape. The killer might not be a stranger passing through. He might be someone who had lived in the area for years. Someone who knew the bush tracks. Someone who knew the hitchhiking routes. Someone who understood exactly where backpackers waited beside the road. And if that theory was correct, then the man responsible might already be living among the same communities investigators were now searching, working, talking to neighbours, reading the same newspaper headlines about the Belanglo murders. and quietly watching as police tried to understand what had happened inside the forest he knew so well. As detectives retraced the victims' journeys, another pattern became clear. Nearly all of them had travelled along the Hume Highway, the long road connecting Sydney and Melbourne, a highway used by thousands of vehicles every day. Truck drivers, tourists, road workers, people whose jobs kept them constantly moving along the same stretch of road. That observation gave investigators a chilling possibility. The killer may have been using the highway itself to find victims, watching hitchhikers, stopping his vehicle, offering a ride, and then turning off the road toward Belanglo. If that theory was correct, it meant something deeply unsettling. The killer had likely encountered dozens, maybe hundreds of travellers over the years, most of them surviving their journeys without ever realising how close they had come to danger. But some had not been so lucky. By now, the investigation had expanded across state lines and international borders. Police were coordinating with foreign embassies. Missing persons reports were being reviewed again. Hostels and travel routes were being mapped. Detectives were speaking with backpackers who had travelled the same highways. Everyone was asking the same question. Who had been offering rides along that road? But there was still one terrifying reality. The man responsible had not been identified. And until he was, there was nothing stopping him from doing it again. Inside Belanglo State Forest, the search had revealed the past, but the investigation now had to focus on the present, on the roads, on the communities nearby, on the people who knew the forest well enough to use it the way the killer had. Because somewhere beyond the trees, the man responsible was still out there. And for years, he had moved through the region without anyone realising what he was capable of. Travellers had entered Belanglo State Forest and hadn't come out. Police knew the killer understood the highways. They knew he knew the forest, and they knew he had been operating for years. But the most disturbing possibility was only just beginning to take shape. The man responsible might not be a stranger passing through. He might be someone much closer than anyone had imagined. Next time, the investigation takes a dramatic turn, and detectives finally begin closing in on the man behind the Belanglo murders.